Imagine for a moment that Cleopatra could have tweeted about her alliance with Mark Antony, or that Alexander the Great could have shared stories of his conquests in real time on Instagram as he marched across Asia. What if Greek philosophers had debated on Reddit, Egyptian scribes had blogged about mummification, or Roman emperors had gone straight to YouTube to explain their military strategies? It seems absurd, doesn't it? But when we delve deeper into this seemingly impossible possibility, we discover something extraordinary about human nature that has remained unchanged over the millennia. The question that haunts us is not only technical, but deeply existential. How would social networks, discussion forums, instant messaging systems, and all the digital infrastructure we know today have transformed not only communication, but the very essence of power, religion, philosophy, and identity in the civilizations that built the foundations of our world? This journey we are about to begin will reveal surprising secrets about who we are as a species and how our thirst for connection transcends any temporal barrier. If you're curious to discover these fascinating revelations that connect our ancestral past with our digital reality, consider subscribing to the channel to support our work of bringing these unique perspectives that help us better understand both our history and our present. To truly understand the impact the internet would have had on ancient civilizations, we must first recognize a fundamental truth that we have often forgotten in our digital age. The human need to communicate, connect, influence, and be understood is not a modern invention, but rather the most primal and powerful impulse that has shaped every great civilization in history. From the earliest hieroglyphics engraved on the walls of Egyptian temples to the complex Roman road systems that facilitated the exchange of information across vast territories, our ancestors always sought ways to transcend the physical limitations of communication. What makes this reflection even more fascinating is realizing that the same motivations that lead us today to post a photo on Instagram, share an opinion on Twitter, or debate in an online forum were exactly the same ones that drove a pharaoh to have his image carved on colossal monuments, a Roman emperor to distribute coins with his face throughout the empire, or a Greek philosopher to gather disciples in the agora to disseminate his ideas. The difference was not in the human essence, but only in the tools available and the speed at which information could travel. When we imagine civilizations such as ancient Egypt, classical Greece, imperial Rome, the Han Dynasty of China, or the great empires of Mesopotamia having instant access to global communication networks, we are not just fantasizing about technology in historical contexts. We are exploring how the same behavioral patterns, political ambitions, spiritual needs, and social conflicts that defined those societies would have manifested and evolved in an environment where information knew no geographic boundaries or temporal limitations. This journey will allow us to discover not only how history could have been different, but how certain human characteristics remain constant regardless of the era or available technology. Let's begin our time journey by imagining the banks of the Nile in the year 1323 BC, during the reign of the young pharaoh Tutankhamun. Egypt at this time was not just a civilization, but a complete universe of rituals, hierarchies, secret knowledge, and centralized power that fundamentally depended on absolute control of information. Priests jealously guarded the secrets of mummification. Scribes were the only people capable of reading and writing hieroglyphics, and the pharaoh was considered a living deity whose words had the power of life and death. Now imagine that, all of a sudden, every peasant, every craftsman, every soldier, and every slave had access to a device that allowed them to communicate instantly with anyone in the kingdom and beyond its borders. The first and most devastating change would be the complete demolition of the informational monopoly that sustained the entire Egyptian social structure. The secrets of the temples, carefully guarded by generations of priests, would be leaked within days by disgruntled or curious scribes. Tutorials on mummification would appear on video platforms, created by embalmers seeking recognition or simply wanting to teach their techniques. Hieroglyphics, until then an exclusive knowledge of the literate elite, would go viral through learning apps created by enterprising scribes who realized the potential for democratizing writing. The very concept of the pharaoh's divinity would be questioned when ordinary people began to interact directly with him through messages, seeing his doubts, his fears, his daily decisions, and discovering that behind the golden mask there was just a human being like any other. But perhaps even more fascinating would be observing how Tutankhamun, a young man of only 18, would react to this digital revolution. Far from being just a victim of circumstance, he would likely have become one of the first influencers in history, using his unique position to build a personal brand that transcended the physical limitations of his kingdom. His posts about palace life, behind the scenes of religious ceremonies, his thoughts on governance, and even his views on art and architecture would attract followers not only from Egypt, but from civilizations as far away as Mesopotamia, Greece, and even more remote places. He would quickly discover that his real influence no longer depended solely on military or religious control of his territory, but on his ability to connect emotionally with people he had never seen and who lived in cultures completely different from his own. This transformation would have created a deep existential crisis at the heart of Egyptian civilization. Priests, realizing that they had lost their power as intermediaries between the gods and the people, would likely have developed sophisticated digital strategies to maintain their relevance. They would have created exclusive content on dream interpretation, astrology, and communication with the world of the dead, turning their temples into studios for the production of mystical content. Some would have adapted brilliantly, becoming the first spiritual coaches in history, offering online consultations on how to achieve immortality or how to interpret the signs of the gods. Others, more resistant to change, would have tried to use their influence to censor or control the flow of information, creating the first conflicts between freedom of expression and religious authority that we know so well today. Scribes, in turn, would have experienced an even more dramatic professional revolution. Some would have become the first investigative journalists in history, exposing scandals in the palaces, revealing corruption among provincial administrators, or documenting the living conditions of the workers who built the pyramids. Others would have discovered creative talents they never knew they possessed, becoming the first travel bloggers by documenting trade expeditions to Sudan, the first food bloggers by exploring the gastronomy of different regions of the Nile, or the first fashion influencers by commenting on the trends in jewelry and clothing they observed in the royal court. The very nature of writing would have changed fundamentally, moving from formal, ritualized hieroglyphics to a more colloquial, emotional, and accessible language that could engage diverse audiences and keep their attention in an increasingly competitive environment for views and likes. But it is when we imagine the geopolitical consequences of this digital revolution that the story becomes truly surprising. Egypt, geographically isolated by the deserts and the sea, would suddenly have found itself instantly connected with all the great civilizations of the time. Diplomatic messages that took months to travel through dangerous caravans would have been exchanged in real time. Trade treaties would have been negotiated through video conferences between pharaohs and kings of distant lands. Most importantly, ideas would have flowed freely across borders, creating an accelerated cultural fusion that would have forever changed not only Egypt, but all connected civilizations. Egyptian engineers would have shared pyramid building techniques with Mesopotamian architects, who in turn would have offered their knowledge of irrigation systems. Doctors from different cultures would have collaborated in real time to treat epidemics, combining knowledge of Egyptian medicinal herbs with surgical techniques developed in India and acupuncture practices from China. Mathematicians would have exchanged discoveries instantly, accelerating the development of concepts that historically took centuries to spread. The very notion of isolated and distinct civilizations would have begun to dissolve in favor of a cultural proto-globalization that would have merged traditions, beliefs, technologies, and art forms in completely new ways. Now let's jump in time and space to 5th century BC Athens, during the height of Athenian democracy and the flowering of Greek philosophy. Here we find a society that already deeply valued public debate, the exchange of ideas, and civic participation, but which was physically limited to the space of the agora and face-to-face assemblies. Imagine Socrates, the philosopher who revolutionized Western thought through his conversations on the streets of Athens, having access to digital platforms that allowed him to reach not only the young aristocrats who frequented the agora, but anyone curious anywhere in the known world. The Socratic method, based on asking provocative questions to make people question their own beliefs, would have gone viral in a way that even Socrates could not have imagined. His philosophical live streams would have attracted massive audiences, with people submitting their existential doubts in real time and Socrates answering with more questions that would challenge not only the original questioner, but all viewers. Debates about ethics, justice, courage, and virtue would have stretched for days in online forums, with participants from dozens of different cultures contributing unique perspectives based on their own traditions and life experiences. The very concept of know thyself would have taken on a whole new dimension when people could explore their identity through interactions with individuals from radically different cultural backgrounds. Plato, the most famous disciple of Socrates, would likely have created the first online educational platform in history, turning his academy into a virtual university that would have offered courses in philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and politics to students from all over the Mediterranean world. His theories about the world of ideas would have gained a particular irony in a digital environment where abstract concepts could be shared instantly through virtual representations. His philosophical dialogues, traditionally written as conversations between characters, would have become interactive podcasts where listeners could influence the course of discussions by submitting questions and comments in real time. Aristotle, with his encyclopedic passion for cataloging and organizing all human knowledge, would have been the creator of the first Wikipedia in history. His obsession with classifying everything from plants and animals to forms of government and types of art would have found in the digital environment the perfect medium to create a collaborative database where experts from different fields could contribute their discoveries and observations. His work on logic and rhetoric would have become even more relevant in a world where the ability to argue convincingly and detect logical fallacies would have been essential for navigating through the sheer volume of information and opinions available online. But perhaps the most profound impact of the internet on ancient Greece would have been on Athenian democracy itself. The Greek political system, based on the direct participation of citizens in assemblies, would have faced a complete revolution when this participation could take place virtually. Suddenly, Athenians living in distant colonies could have voted in real time on issues that affected the entire polis. Political debates would have extended far beyond the physical confines of the agora, allowing for much broader and more diverse participation in the democratic process. We have now arrived at the most crucial moment of our temporal journey, where we must explore the most dramatic and transformative consequences that the internet would have caused at the heart of the greatest empire the ancient world had ever known. Rome in the first century of the Christian era was not just a city or even a country, but a political, military, and cultural organism that stretched from the mists of Britain to the sands of Egypt, from the forests of Germania to the mountains of Spain. It was such a sophisticated machine of war and administration that it was able to hold together under a single authority hundreds of different peoples, different languages, millennial traditions, and cultures that had their own ways of understanding the world and the gods. When we imagine Emperor Augustus, the first Caesar to consolidate Roman imperial power, having access to social media and instant communication, we are not just talking about a political leader using new tools, but about a complete revolution in the nature of imperial power. Augustus was a master of political propaganda long before the internet existed, using coins, statues, monuments, public games, and works of art to build his image as a peacemaker and restorer of Roman greatness. With access to the internet, he would have become probably the first emperor influencer in history, using his charismatic personality and refined political intelligence to build a direct emotional connection with every Roman citizen, from the humblest peasant in Gaul to the richest merchant in Alexandria. His daily posts would have documented not only his political decisions and military achievements, but also his personal life, his thoughts on literature and art, his views on Stoic philosophy, and even his concerns as a family man. He would have quickly discovered that his real power no longer depended solely on his control of the legions or the Senate, but on his ability to present himself as an authentic and approachable leader who genuinely cared about the well-being of his subjects. This personalization of imperial power would have created a dangerous and fascinating precedent, establishing a direct relationship between ruler and ruled that would have completely circumvented traditional institutions of political mediation. But it is when we consider the impact of the internet on the Roman legions that history becomes truly revolutionary. Roman soldiers, traditionally isolated in remote camps on the borders of the empire, would suddenly have had instant access not only to their families in Rome, but also to information about what was happening in other parts of the empire. A legionnaire stationed at Hadrian's Wall in Britain could have conversed in real time with his colleagues fighting against the Parthians in Mesopotamia, exchanging military tactics, sharing experiences about different enemy cultures, and most importantly, organizing politically in ways that had never been possible before. This connectivity would have fundamentally transformed the relationship between soldiers and their commanders. Corrupt or incompetent generals could no longer have hidden their failures or abuses, as disgruntled soldiers would have documented and shared evidence of poor leadership instantly. On the other hand, charismatic and competent commanders would have built a loyal following not only in their own legions but throughout the Roman army, creating networks of influence that could have challenged the emperor himself. Traditional Roman military discipline, based on rigid hierarchy and isolation of troops, would have collapsed when ordinary soldiers could question orders, debate strategies, and even negotiate collectively for better conditions of service. Most fascinating would have been observing how this digital revolution would have affected relations between Rome and the conquered peoples. Traditionally, the Roman Empire maintained control through a combination of military force, gradual cultural integration, and isolation of rebel groups that could organize resistance. With the internet, tribal leaders in Gaul could have coordinated revolts with Germanic kings, Celtic druids could have shared strategies of cultural resistance with Egyptian priests, and Greek intellectuals could have inspired independence movements in distant provinces through philosophical writings on freedom and self-determination. But Rome, being Rome, would probably have found creative ways to use this connectivity to its advantage. Imperial administrators would have developed the first digital intelligence systems in history, monitoring communications between potentially rebellious groups and using primitive algorithms to identify patterns of discontent before they escalated into open uprisings. They would have created massive entertainment content to distract conquered populations, turning Colosseum games into live-stream spectacles broadcast to amphitheaters throughout the empire, creating a Roman mass culture that would have rivaled local traditions for people's attention and loyalty. Now let's transport ourselves to the other side of the world, to China during the Han Dynasty, around the same period when Rome was at its peak. The Chinese Empire had unique characteristics that would have made its interaction with the internet particularly fascinating. Unlike Rome, which was fundamentally a military civilization that expanded through conquest, Han China based its power on bureaucratic sophistication, the Confucian intellectual tradition, and an examination system that selected civil servants based on academic merit rather than birth or wealth. Emperor Wu, known for expanding the Chinese Empire into Central Asia and establishing the Silk Road, could have used the internet to create the first digital trade network in history. Imagine merchants in Chang'an being able to trade directly with silk sellers in Kashgar, or Roman merchants in Antioch placing orders for spices from suppliers in Guangzhou without the need for middlemen along the perilous months-long journey through the mountains and deserts of Asia. This digitization of trade would have exponentially accelerated the exchange not only of products, but of ideas, technologies, religions, and art forms, creating a cultural globalization 1,500 years before Columbus arrived in the Americas. The Chinese mandarins, the intellectual elite who ruled the empire through their mastery of the Confucian classics, would have faced an even deeper existential crisis than the Egyptian priests or the Roman senators. Their power depended entirely on their monopoly over literate knowledge and the ability to interpret ancient texts in ways that justified their political decisions. With the internet democratizing access to these texts and allowing anyone educated to offer alternative interpretations, China's entire system of imperial legitimacy would have collapsed. Students in remote villages could have debated Confucian philosophy directly with the capital's top experts. Ambitious young people could have created educational content that rivaled official teaching, and heterodox thinkers could have disseminated ideas that would have challenged the theoretical foundations of the imperial state. But perhaps even more revolutionary would have been the internet's impact on Chinese inventions and discoveries that historically took centuries to reach the rest of the world. Gunpowder, the compass, paper, the printing press, and dozens of other innovations that transformed human civilization could have spread instantaneously through digital networks. Roman engineers would have learned about Chinese iron casting in real time. Indian mathematicians would have collaborated with Chinese astronomers to develop more accurate calendars, and Greek physicians would have integrated Chinese acupuncture techniques with their own traditions based on the theory of bodily humors. This acceleration of technological innovation would have created a ripple effect that would have completely changed the course of human history. Civilizations that historically developed independently for centuries would suddenly have found themselves in a global race for innovation, where the best ideas from any one culture would have become instantly available to everyone else. The European Dark Ages might never have happened if classical Greek and Roman knowledge had been digitally preserved and accessible to scholars in Irish monasteries. The Renaissance could have begun in the 5th century instead of the 15th century, accelerated by the digital rediscovery of ancient texts that in reality had been lost for 1,000 years. But it is when we imagine the impact of the internet on the emerging religions of this period that we arrive at the most profound and lasting transformations. Christianity, which historically spread through the Roman Empire over 3 centuries of persecution, martyrdom, and clandestine evangelization, would have found in the internet a dissemination tool impossible to control or suppress. The apostles could have created the first virtual religious communities in history, connecting persecuted Christians in Rome with fellow believers in Alexandria, Antioch, and even in India, where, according to tradition, the Apostle Thomas established the first Eastern Christian communities. Paul's epistles, which in actual history relied on messengers traveling for weeks through dangerous territories, would have become instant posts that would have reached thousands of new converts simultaneously. Theological debates about the divine nature of Christ, the importance of Jewish law for Gentile Christians, and the organization of early Christian communities would have taken place in online forums where participants from dozens of different cultures would have contributed their own perspectives and interpretations of Scripture. The very development of the biblical canon would have been transformed when different Christian communities could instantly share their sacred texts, compare versions, and debate which books should be considered divinely inspired. We have reached the end of our journey through time and imagination, but what we have discovered along this path goes far beyond simple speculation about technology in historical contexts. What we have really explored is the most fundamental nature of the human condition and how certain characteristics of our species remain absolutely constant, regardless of the era, the culture, or the tools available. When we imagine Cleopatra making Instagram stories, Socrates creating philosophical live streams, or Augustus becoming the first emperor influencer in history, we are not just playing with fun anachronisms. We are recognizing that the human thirst for connection, recognition, influence, and understanding transcends any temporal or technological barrier. The internet in the hands of ancient civilizations would have been simultaneously a force of radical democratization and an even more sophisticated instrument of control than any tool of power these empires ever possessed. The same pharaohs who used colossal monuments to project their divinity would have found that authentic Facebook posts could have been even more effective for building emotional loyalty. The same Greek philosophers who debated in the Agora would have found in the internet an infinitely more powerful means to spread their ideas and question established structures of thought. The same Roman emperors who used bread and circuses to entertain the masses would have created the first systems of mass digital entertainment, keeping their populations connected and distracted in ways that would have made Colosseum games seem primitive by comparison. But perhaps the most surprising finding of our exploration is realizing that the dilemmas, conflicts, and challenges we face today in our digital age are not new in human history, but are only amplified and accelerated by technology. The tension between freedom of expression and authoritarian control that we see today on social media is the same tension that existed between Egyptian scribes and priests who wanted to keep their secrets. Debates about fake news and information manipulation that dominate our era find their predecessors in the propaganda techniques that Augustus used to build his imperial image. Contemporary discussions about digital privacy and government surveillance echo concerns that Chinese mandarins would have had about monitoring communications among potentially rebellious groups in their remote provinces. What makes this reflection even more fascinating is recognizing that the solutions and adaptations that these ancient civilizations would have developed to cope with the digital revolution can offer valuable insights for our own contemporary challenges. The Greek tradition of valuing public debate and constantly questioning established ideas could have created the first effective systems to combat disinformation. Chinese bureaucratic sophistication could have developed ways to regulate online content that balanced freedom of expression with social responsibility. Rome's ability to integrate diverse cultures under a single political framework could have inspired the first truly global models of digital governance. At the end of this journey, we are confronted with a truth that is both humbling and inspiring. Humbling because we realize that our contemporary problems, anxieties, and conflicts are not unique or special, but are manifestations of behavioral patterns that repeat themselves throughout human history with an almost mathematical consistency. Inspiring because we have found that our species has always found creative, resilient, and surprisingly elegant ways to adapt to the most radical technological changes, turning seemingly impossible challenges into opportunities for cultural and spiritual evolution. The civilizations we have explored today live on in us, in our institutions, in our values, and in the way we navigate through the complexities of the digital age, proving that we are much more than products of our time, but are heirs to a millennia-old human tradition of curiosity, adaptability, and an unquenchable thirst for connection with our fellow human beings. If you've made it this far and aren't subscribed yet, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and share in the comments which ancient civilization you'd like to see connected to the internet in our next videos.